This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.
Aloha, and welcome to the monthly public lecture of the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii. The Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, since 1990, has continued to follow our mission of promoting human health, animal rights, and protection of the environment by means of vegetarian education. We'd like to encourage those of you who are not yet members, and even those of you who are not yet vegetarians, to join the Vegetarian Society tonight. Our members receive an informative newsletter, as well as discounts at grocery stores such as Down to Earth, all vegetarian, organic, and natural, and many vegan and vegetarian-friendly restaurants. Your membership will more than pay for itself, even if you spend only $10 a week on groceries or on eating out. So please join tonight before you leave, or join online at vsh.org. I'd like to take this opportunity now to acknowledge our wonderful meeting volunteers. Angie Phan, who's brought our refreshments from Down to Earth today. UH Professor Emeritus Carl Seff, who not only is providing our refreshment supplies, but transportation for our speaker and her beautiful lei as well. Patrick and Sirlak again, who are staffing our free literature table. Dr. Bill Harris at the video camera, and Georgie Yap, Angie, and Carl again in the kitchen. If you'd like to join them and the rest of us in having a great time while doing something positive for the world, please see one of us before you go. We're videotaping tonight's presentation for broadcast on the VSH TV series Vegetarian, which appears on public access channels across the state, including on Oahu's Olelo Channel 52. You can also view videos of this and many of our past presentations on our website, vsh.org, where you'll also find lots of other great information, including recipes, our famous dining guide, as well as past newsletters. It's now time for our special guest. We're delighted to have with us tonight Sarah Taylor. A vegan since 2002, Sarah Taylor is the creator of Vegan Next Door and the author of Vegan in 30 Days. A graduate of the University of Washington with an MBA from Seattle University, she also holds a certificate in plant-based nutrition from Cornell University and is on the faculty of the Nutritional Education Institute. She has worked as a motivational trainer for Joel Fuhrman, MD, the author of the authoritative plant-based Eat to Live diet, and has been interviewed for countless radio and internet shows, including NPR, PBS, and Earth Save Radio, among others. She lives with her husband Mark and many pets in Gig Harbor, Washington. Among her many other activities, she plays competitive tennis and is an active board member of Leilani Farm Sanctuary, a haven for rescued farm animals in Haiku, Maui. Sarah's talk tonight, Vegetarian to Vegan, is based on her new book of the same name coming out later this year. Sarah will answer the question that many vegetarians might have: why should we give up dairy and egg products too? She'll not only focus on the very good health and ethical reasons for doing so, but give us some specific tips for making it work as well. Please welcome Sarah Taylor.
The majority of people believed that the sun revolved around the earth, and they were wrong. During the times of Columbus, the majority of people believed that the earth was flat, and they too were wrong. During our parents' generation, they believed that smoking was harmless, and they too were wrong. So I begin this lecture today asking you to keep an open mind, remembering that there are countless examples in history when people thought that they knew something was definitely true, only to be found out later that they were wrong. And as Mark Twain once said, whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect. So I begin tonight by asking you why you became vegetarian. And the reason that I ask this question is because many people find that the reason they go vegan is the same reason that they went vegetarian in the first place. So if you went vegetarian for your health, thinking that meat was not a healthy thing to be putting into your body, it's often true that when you find the right information about dairy products, you're even more compelled to give up dairy, because science shows, in my opinion, that dairy is actually far less healthy for you than meat. And when people ask me, what's the one thing I could give up? If I'm not willing to go vegan, what's the one thing I could give up for my health? I tell them dairy. And similarly, people read about the slaughterhouses and they say, oh my word, I can't believe that's happening. If I'd only known, I am never eating meat again. Yet when they find out what's happening in the dairy farms with the dairy cows, and when they find out what's happening in the egg production factories with the laying hens that lay the eggs we eat, they're even more compelled to give up dairy and eggs than they were in the first place to give up meat, because not only do those animals live lives truly of hell to bring those products to us, they go to the exact same slaughterhouses as their meat counterparts did in the first place. Tonight, I'm going to focus on health and animal welfare. And specifically, what I'm going to focus on is the health reasons to give up dairy products and the animal welfare reasons to give up eggs. So let's start with going from vegetarian to vegan for your health. You may not have ever thought about this, or you may know this as fact, that dairy products all start as milk. No matter what dairy product you're talking about, it once started as milk. And the reason why I bring this up is simply because I'm going to be talking about a lot of medical research. And when medical researchers want to study dairy, they often look at milk because everything comes from milk in the dairy department. So it's not necessarily true that if I show a study that correlates breast cancer to milk, that you would have the exact same result with breast cancer in cheese. But there's a very good chance of it because cheese once started as milk. I'd like to start with the topic of animal protein specifically and cancer. Now, those of us who love animals don't like to talk about animal research, but unfortunately it's a fact of life that happens. And if it's happening, I'm glad that we have some information that actually is very compelling. Many of you have heard of Colin Campbell. He wrote an incredible book called The China Study. And one of the things he talks about in this book is some research that was done in India back in the 1960s. And these researchers took a group of rats and they exposed them to a cancer-causing agent, a carcinogen, called aflatoxin. And aflatoxin is known to cause cancer. It's specifically known to cause liver cancer. And so they exposed these rats to aflatoxin, and then they put the rats into two groups. Group 1 got a high-protein diet made up of 20% protein, and Group 2 got a low-protein diet made up of only 5% protein. The specific type of protein they were using in this study is called casein. And casein is protein that comes from animals, and it's found in extremely high concentrations in dairy products. It's found, I believe, in all mammals' milk products, but it's in very, very high concentrations, for example, in cow's milk. And the concentration of casein in cow's milk is 20 times higher than it is in human milk. So they follow these rats out on a high-protein or a low-protein diet after they'd been exposed to aflatoxin to see whether the rats would develop what I'll just call cancer or precancerous lesions, to simplify. Looking at the top table, you can see that in the group of rats that had a 20% or high-protein diet, all of them developed either cancer or precancerous lesions, every single one of them. And in the group that had the low-protein diet, none of them developed cancer or precancerous lesions. And this is very, very rare to see in medical science. I work in medical research, and when you see a result where you have 100% in one group and 0% in the other group, it's usually assumed that something went very wrong with your methodology. So Colin Campbell ended up reproducing these studies, and he did find the exact same results. But these researchers in India, they thought this first study was so interesting that they went on to do a similar study, taking the rats, exposing them to the aflatoxin, putting them on a high or low protein diet, and then watching them for almost 2 years, 100 weeks, to see who would live and who wouldn't live. And once again, after almost 2 years, they found all or nothing results. All of the rats on the high protein diet, none of the rats on the low protein diet were dead after 100 weeks. I hope you find this as compelling as I do. It definitely brings up a question about protein. Colin Campbell went on to reproduce those studies that were done in the 60s, and he did find the same results. And he went on further, and he did what I call the light switch studies, that's just my own term, showing that if he put rats on a high-protein diet, and then after a few weeks switched them to a low-protein diet, 3 weeks later back onto a high-protein, back on a low-protein, he could turn cancer on and off like a light switch. Very, very interesting. And what I love about this study is that, it was back in maybe the late 80s that Dean Ornish was the first person to prove that you can actually regress heart disease. You can actually get atherosclerosis to regress out of your blood vessels. And that was one of those truths that medical doctors thought could never be done. Once you have plaque, it's there forever. He showed that's not true. And this study here shows that once you get cancer, it can regress. We know this. So I think that's very interesting. But the question here was, is this a problem with protein, or is this specifically a problem with animal protein? So Colin Campbell recreated all of those studies using soy protein and wheat protein, all plant-based proteins, and he found that none of the rats in the low-protein group and none of the rats in the high-protein group developed cancer. Even at levels of 20% of plant protein, there was no effect causing cancer. So after this whole series of studies, Colin Campbell concluded that casein is the most relevant chemical carcinogen ever identified. So the next question became, can you see proof of this in humans? And indeed, there's proof all over the medical literature that there's a link between animal protein and cancer. Looking at ovarian cancer, the Iowa Women's Health Study found that women who consumed more than 1 glass of milk per day had a 73% greater chance of ovarian cancer than women who drank less than a glass of milk per day. Moving to breast cancer. In breast cancer, they looked at the amount of milk consumption per day by country, and they looked at the rates of breast cancer and correlated the two. And if you look on the screen, you can see in the top right corner, the countries that had the highest levels of milk consumption also had the highest levels of breast cancer. And those are countries like the US, like France, places where we love our cheese and our dairy products. And the countries in the bottom left-hand corner, like Japan and Korea, Mali, Zimbabwe, these are countries where dairy products either aren't part of their culture or they just simply can't afford to raise livestock because they're very poor countries. And so very interesting studies showing a very high correlation between those countries that like to consume milk and their rates of breast cancer. But one of the questions that comes up if you're forward thinking is, well, maybe those countries in the bottom left-hand corner of this graph are countries with different genetics, and maybe their genetics keep them from getting breast cancer. But in fact, they've actually studied that too, and they've studied those in migration studies, looking at populations where the genes are pure, meaning, for example, in the studies in Japanese people, they looked at people who were fully Japanese, and then they migrated to the US. And what they found is that when they migrated to the new countries, they took on the risk of that country, and specifically their generations did. So maybe the first generation moves over from Japan and they're still eating rice and vegetables and maybe some fish, but their kids grow up in American society with McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken, and those kids have the exact same risk factors as American kids, even though genetically they're fully Japanese. The same, this graph is similarly true for uterine cancer, that this graphs look almost identical. But many people say, well, look, I'm a very health-conscious person, and I don't drink full-fat milk, I don't eat full-fat dairy products. What about non-fat milk? Well, here's the study that goes to show that in prostate cancer, the rates of mortality in men aged 65 to 74 years, those that drank the most non-fat milk per day had the highest rates of death from prostate cancer. Well, isn't this interesting? Well, that goes to make a lot of sense, and I'm going to make up these numbers, so don't quote me on these numbers, but imagine that you have a glass of milk, and imagine that it's, say, 50% protein and 50% fat. Those aren't the numbers, but just bear with me. If you decided to take that into a non-fat glass of milk and you took out all the fat, you would be increasing the ratio of protein, right? Well, we've just shown by those beautifully done rat studies that the animal protein is highly carcinogenic. And when you look at a graph showing a decrease in the amount of fat between 2% milk, skim milk, and non-fat milk, you can see the blue line, the fat is definitely decreasing, but in the red line you can see that the percentage of calories from protein are increasing. So it actually makes sense that those of you who are health conscious, thinking you want to, lower your risk for heart disease, not gain weight, and you're staying away from fatty dairy products, when you switch over to non-fat or very low-fat dairy products, you may be doing your heart and your waistline some good, but you're increasing your risk for cancer. Well, let's turn to heart disease. We know that dairy has very high amounts of fat and cholesterol in almost all cases, and I don't need to show you studies, I don't think, that prove that fatty diets and high cholesterol diets are very, very highly correlated with heart disease. But there was a really interesting study done by Caldwell Esselstyn, and Caldwell Esselstyn was at the Cleveland Clinic working in the surgery center, and he saw all these patients coming in that were really, really ill from heart disease. Patients who had not just had bypass surgery, but had multiple bypass surgeries, multiple admissions to the emergency room due to angina. People who couldn't even walk across the sky bridge from the parking lot to the clinic because they were so sick. And their doctors and their surgeons were pretty much giving up on them, saying, we can't do another bypass. Your arteries are not strong enough to go through another bypass. Why don't you go talk to Caldwell Esselstyn? And he was kind of a last resort. And what he did was he put these very, very ill patients on not just a vegan diet, but a very healthy, low-fat vegan diet, what I call a whole plant foods-based diet. Not Coca-Cola and French fries, for sure. Whole beans and whole rices and grains and fruits and vegetables. And what he found is that not only did these patients' heart disease clear up, but none of these patients had recurring heart events, and all of them were still alive 20 years later. And I think that's a really interesting point, because people that come in to his office that have had multiple bypass surgeries and multiple heart attacks, these are not patients in their 20s or 30s. These are generally going to be patients that are probably in their 50s or 60s. And the fact that they were so sick, yet 20 years later, probably into their 80s, they're still alive, these are tremendous results, really tremendous results. One of these patients did get cancer. It was not fatal, but statistically speaking, just population-based studies would tell you that 8 or 10 of those patients should have developed some form of cancer. Only one did, and it was not fatal. The Lyon Heart Study. I love talking about this one. My favorite blog I ever wrote. You've all heard about the Mediterranean diet, yes? Okay, we hear about the Mediterranean diet. It's so healthy. I eat a Mediterranean diet. And people always ask, but what about olive oil? Olive oil is so healthy. Well, here's the real story behind that, and here's the study where it all came from. In the Lyon Heart Study, patients that had had at least one heart attack were told to go on a Mediterranean diet. And this was basically fruits and vegetables, beans, grains, maybe some low-fat fishes or low-fat chicken, maybe a little bit of low-fat dairy. And they were specifically told that monounsaturated fats were good, and if they went and used a lot of olive oil, those would have a lot of healthy fats in them. So they should make sure they were cooking with a lot of olive oil instead of other fats like butter. The great news from this study was that there were two groups, the control group that was eating the standard diet. They were told not to do anything differently, but the treatment group was eating the Mediterranean diet, and those on the Mediterranean diet had 50 to 70% fewer heart attacks than the ones that were eating their standard diet, which was very much like a standard American diet. So 50 to 70% fewer heart attacks was a huge way for the press to get headlines, and a huge way for olive oil marketers to market their olive oil. What they don't tell you in those headlines is that 1 out of 4 people that were on the Mediterranean diet still either had another heart attack or they died. So I don't know about you, but I do not like my risk being 1 out of 4. It's terrible odds. And that's what they don't show you. When people say, well, I eat a Mediterranean diet, 1 out of 4 risk of heart disease or death. I eat olive oil. Oils are not healthy. I'm not saying that I never eat them. I'm not that great with my diet as far as not having any oil, but I definitely try to keep it out because oils are not healthy, even the heart healthy ones like olive oil. The other thing that this study tells me is that 30% of your diet, which is what the Mediterranean group was striving for, to get it down to 30% of their diet, that's still far too high. It's still far too high. It results in 1 out of 4 of these patients having another heart attack or dying. An average vegan diet is somewhere between 10 and 20% fat. And if you're really being careful about consuming excess oils and kind of vegan transition-y treat foods, like butters and things like that, cookies made with vegan butter, your diet will be around 10% fat. There are a host of other diseases that have been linked to dairy products. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to talk about one just as a representative example of how these different diseases are linked to dairy. And the one that I've picked is osteoporosis. We've all been taught that dairy equals calcium, and we've been taught that calcium equals strong bones. And it's true that calcium leads to strong bones. You need calcium for strong bones. But it is not true that dairy equals strong bones. And I know this sounds heretical, and this is where I'm asking you to keep an open mind if you've not heard this argument before. But here's how it works. Dairy products are very acidic. And when you eat acidic foods, the pH level in your blood becomes acidic. And the pH level of your blood needs to stay in a very narrow range or you'll die very quickly. So that's okay. We don't have to worry about this because our bodies automatically know how to take care of this problem. When we eat acidic foods, our body alkalizes that acidity in our blood by leaching calcium out of our bone and into our blood. And when you have a serving of dairy, what happens is you take in calcium from the dairy products. They are high in calcium, but you're taking out even more calcium out of your bones to alkalize your blood. So you end up with a net deficit of calcium. When I heard this data, of course, this is very compelling, but I'm in medical research, and I tend to start going, yeah, but. And I said, yeah, but if this were true, the countries that are eating the most dairy products and getting the most calcium through their dairy products would have the highest rates of osteoporosis. And indeed, that is exactly true. Just like I showed you the breast cancer and milk study with all the different countries on it, there's exactly the same, almost exactly the same. The correlation of calcium consumption through dairy products, specifically through dairy products by country, is very highly correlated to the rates of osteoporosis. And those countries that don't drink milk and eat dairy products, like Zimbabwe and Mali and Japan and places like that, they generally have low rates of osteoporosis. But the countries that have the highest rates of calcium intake through dairy products have the highest rates of osteoporosis. Some more data shows that in a 12-year Harvard study of 78,000 women, those who drank milk 3 times a day actually broke more bones than women who rarely drank milk. 78,000 people, by the way, is a huge feat in a medical study. That should be really reliable data. Other research shows that those with the highest dairy product consumption had approximately double the risk of hip fracture compared to those with the lowest consumption. So I feel that I need to be fair balanced when I talk about medical research because not all of the large-scale studies show a correlation between milk consumption and increased rates of osteoporosis and hip fractures. Some of them show not a very strong correlation. But here's something interesting. I have never come across a really large-scale, well-controlled study that shows that the more dairy you eat, the lower your rate for osteoporosis. And isn't that what we're all taught? Milk does a body good. Milk is good for your bones. Well, where are the studies to prove it? Because I'm not finding them. Like I mentioned, there's a host of other diseases that have been highly linked to dairy consumption. Multiple sclerosis and type 1 diabetes, I think, have some extremely strong arguments behind them. But a lot of other autoimmune diseases, too. Most doctors, they'll tell you autoimmune diseases are idiopathic. We don't know why they happen. But in fact, there's a lot of data pointing to dairy. For those of you who have heard of Joel Fuhrman, that's somebody that Lorraine mentioned in her introduction that I worked with. So there are other doctors as well. I just happen to know his research very well, and his patients. He's been treating patients for 25 years, more than 25 years, with a low-fat vegan diet. He has so many success stories, not just of people who have lost tremendous amounts of weight, hundreds and hundreds of pounds, not just patients who have reversed their heart disease or cancer, but patients who have been reversing diseases that doctors think can't be cured, and they've been curing them. And he's got so many of them, so many rheumatoid arthritis patients and multiple sclerosis patients and Crohn's patients, and the list goes on. He's got so many of these patients on his website that under success stories, he actually, breaks them out per disease. And you can click on psoriasis and find a host of people who have cleared up psoriasis through diet alone without medication. His name again is Joel Fuhrman, Fuhrman. I like to give sources of all these people who have written great books and have great websites. I'd like to finish the section on health with this quick graph on nutrition. It's just an interesting way to look at the foods that we eat from a big picture view. Across the top, I've got a host of different parts of our food that you will find in your diet. The first four are things that we're generally told to keep very low in our diet based on the research. So keep the amounts of fat, animal protein, cholesterol, and calories low. You don't want a diet high in any of those things. The last three columns are things we're told are very healthy and that we want to increase in our diet. These are things like fiber, vitamins and minerals, antioxidants, and water. Down the left-hand column, you see the major food groups. Meat, dairy, non-fat dairy, and eggs are all generally very high in fat, animal protein, cholesterol, and calories, but they have very negligible amounts, if any, of fiber, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and water. However, if you look at the vegan foods, the whole beans and grains, the fruits and vegetables, these have either none or either no or very negligible amounts of fat, animal protein, cholesterol, and calories, but they're very high in fiber, micronutrients, and water. So I think when people see this on a very simple table, it kind of sums up many of the health reasons why you would want to stay away from meat and dairy products and eggs and move toward a vegan diet. I love this quote. People eat meat and think they will become strong as an ox, forgetting that the ox eats grass. In fact, many of the strongest animals on our planet, elephants and horses and buffaloes, they're all vegan. So even if you are, an athlete and you're thinking, but I'm an athlete, I need to be strong, the strongest animals on the planet are vegan, and some of the best athletes in the world are vegan, including Ruth Heydrich, who's here. Where's Ruth? Yeah, amazing triathlete. Well, let's turn tacks here a little bit and talk about why you might want to go from vegetarian to vegan for the animals. I have a very easy time talking about medical research, but I don't have a very easy time talking about animal welfare, I'll be honest, and I've avoided this topic for a long time. I procrastinated writing this book for a couple of years because this topic is just a very, very difficult one for me. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to focus on the animal welfare reasons to give up eating eggs. I don't have time to go over dairy, but I want you to know that I'm going to go through a lot of information about laying hens that lay the eggs for us. And as horrific as that story is, the dairy cow story is just as horrific. So although I don't have time to talk about it today, I want you to know about it and either read about it in my book when the book comes out, Vegetarian to Vegan, or look it up on the internet, read some books. If you can stomach it, I have another resource for you. It's a documentary called Earthlings. Earthlings is probably the most powerful movie I've ever watched in my life. It took me a month to watch it because I am tender-hearted and it's very difficult to watch. But if you're looking for compelling reasons to go vegan, you'll not find any more compelling reasons in the area of animal welfare than Earthlings. So let's talk about the laying hens. 50 billion, that's billion with a B, 50 billion chickens are raised every year for their meat and eggs. Chickens naturally live about 6 years, but egg-laying hens in our food production system are slaughtered after just 1 year because their bodies are so worn out they can't go on any longer. Now, you may or may not know this, but chickens raised in the food production system are bred into one of two types. One type are called broiler chickens, and these are the chickens that are bred specifically to grow really fast and grow really big so that the meat industry can raise them as fast as they can, get as much meat off them as they can, and profit as much as they can. These chickens are grown and bred to be very different from laying hens. And laying hens, as the name applies, they lay eggs for us. And laying hens don't need to be that big. There's a lot of problems that come with raising chickens that are far bigger than Mother Nature intended. So they don't raise them to be big, but they do raise them to produce huge amounts of eggs. Many, many, many more eggs than Mother Nature ever intended. And so we're going to be talking about some of the issues that come from that. Laying hens are kept in battery cages, and battery cages are the size of a file drawer, and they hold about 8 to 10 hens each. So each hen is given the amount of space that's less than a sheet of paper. The cages are stacked one on top of each other to maximize space, and they're kept in warehouses that are enormous. You can see here that the laying hens are crammed into these cages, and you can see how they're stacked on top of each other. The hens from the upper cages are urinating and defecating. The floors are made of wire, so all of that urine and feces is falling down on the other hens. Out on Maui a few years ago, Laura Lee Blanchard from Leilani Farm Sanctuary and Steve Blake, who runs the Maui chapter of the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a handful of them went out and they saved a bunch of chickens that had been left for dead at an egg production facility that had closed down. And they had been living there for about 20 days without any food or water. They'd just been left to die. And they heard about this, and they all went racing down there to save the remaining hens that were still alive. Not very many of them were still alive, but there were some. And they said that these hens were brown. They thought they had brown hens. And once they had rescued them and took them home, and they had been cleaned off, they were actually snowy white. So these are really, really filthy conditions. The feeding and watering is automated in the battery cages to reduce the need for further employees that, of course, are expensive. But the hens will sometimes fall out of their cages or get their limbs or their heads stuck in the bars of the cages. And without people to come around and supervise, the hens will often die like that because no one's around to save them. And when they die, the other hens will have to live with their dead bodies because no one's coming around regularly to supervise and take out the dead hens. Dead animals rotting and feces and urine everywhere, and the stench and the smell, it's just unimaginable. And I liken it to if we had to live in an elevator. Imagine you were born and you were put into an elevator with 6 or 8 other people, and you all had to live there. And there's no fresh sunlight coming in to warm you. You know, there's no wind to come through. There's no rain to fall on you. The stench is overwhelming. There's no room to run. There's no room to really lie down. This is really what it's like. This hen impaled her beak on a loose wire that was right by her watering container. And nobody found it, not found her in time, and she starved or dehydrated to death. And you need to know that 95% of all the commercial layer hens in the United States are kept in these conditions. So the biggest problem with these conditions is the crowding. All of these hens being crowded into these cages cause a huge number of problems. The first problem is that it leads to high rates of infection. There are a lot of feet problems that occur. There's something called cage layer osteoporosis that I'll talk about, and a host of abnormal psychological behaviors. Like I said, if we were living our lives in an elevator with 6 to 8 other people, you can imagine you'd probably go crazy, truly crazy. So let's start with a little bit of information on infection. I talked about how the floors are made of wire and all the problems that come with excrement falling down on them and dead hens not being removed. This becomes really a breeding ground for bacteria. So salmonella is 3 times higher in caged hens than it is in free-range hens, and E. coli is found in 99% of uncooked chicken, which is why we're told to cook our chicken very, very carefully. Antibiotics are used prophylactically, meaning that they're used before they're even needed, assuming that they will be needed because these conditions are so dirty. And it's thought that this prophylactic use of antibiotics in billions of chickens and hundreds of thousands or millions of cows, I mean, all these animals getting prophylactic use of antibiotics is thought to be the number one reason why we're getting resistance and the antibiotics are not working in humans now. A lot of feet problems occur when you're standing on wire floors your whole life. The chickens get swollen feet, they get caked in dirt and excrement, they get broken bones, they get leg disorders and joint pain, and their feet can get caught in the mesh, and they can literally be so crowded into their cages that their feet will be standing in the same place for so long that they meld into the mesh. Here's a picture of a hen with a very swollen foot. I don't know the cause of it. Here is a hen that was rescued, and she couldn't lift her feet because of all the dirt and excrement that was caked onto it. Making eggs requires a lot of calcium, and the hens normally in nature would make a certain number of eggs. I don't know what that is, but egg producers are breeding them to make far more eggs than they're supposed to make naturally. And when you combine that with the fact that they're not getting any exercise because they're kept in cages their whole lives, they become calcium deficient, and this leads to osteoporosis. Interestingly, it's called cage layer osteoporosis because the only place you ever see it is in cage-laying hens. You never see this in nature. Their bones become brittle, they fracture, and bone fractures are 5 times more common in battery cage hens than hens from other housing systems. Another problem with crowding these birds together is that they start to peck each other. And it's thought that part of it is because they're really going crazy and they start to peck each other aggressively. They start to attack each other. But it's also thought that it's just redirected behavior because naturally, chickens like to go out in nature and they peck all day long. They're pecking around for food and for insects and things, and it's a very natural behavior for them. And so when you take them out of their natural conditions, they still try to do their natural behaviors, and so they just start pecking. This will lead to feathers being ripped out of other hens and really painful sores and skin wounds that can become bloody and pussy and wide open wounds. Here's a photo of some hens. You can see the hens in this cage have lost huge numbers of feathers. They've got wounds, and you can see the hen in the cage behind is suffering from the same thing. It's absolutely pervasive. Almost every hen in battery cages suffers from this, and they look like this. Here's a kicker. This is why it's so hard to talk about this. The feather pecking can get so severe that the hens start to actually aim for each other's wounds. And they actually aim for their cloaca. It's called vent pecking when they do that. The cloaca is the area where the urogenital tract and the intestinal tract exit the body. That's where eggs come out. And when a hen lays an egg, that area becomes everted and swollen, and that becomes another target. And so these hens are pecking each other so violently that they eventually will start eating the hens who have the most sores and the most wounds, and they become cannibalistic. This is a really big problem for the egg industry and a big reason why they lose money. On the low range, 7% of the hens in these systems are cannibalized by their fellow cage mates. 7% on the low estimate. It's considered to be 18% on the high estimate, but that's not usually counting vent cannibalism, which is a considerably different statistic in that industry. So they separate out cannibalism from feather pecking and cannibalism from vent pecking. And if you put those two together, it's probably much higher than this. I'm not going to go through all these abnormal behaviors, but there's just so many horrible things that result from hens being crowded together. They peck each other's swollen adrenal glands in their toes. They pluck feathers out of their own bodies. They self-mutilate. They sham dust bathe, something that they do naturally that they can't do in the cages because there is no dust, but they try anyway. They get stereotypies, which are repetitive psychological behaviors like rocking or pacing. They can start chewing on the sides of their cages repetitively. When they do this, they can actually get zinc poisoning because the bars of the cages have zinc oxide on them, and that results in polydipsia, which is an excessive thirst type of thing where they can't quit drinking. So I don't need to go into all of these in detail. You might be getting tired of hearing about chickens and laying hens, but the point I'm trying to make is that these conditions are so bad that a host of problems erupt from these conditions. Well, it's very expensive when you have your hens pecking at each other and cannibalizing each other and all these things. So the egg industry has to take some preventative measures to help reduce these things from happening. And they do a host of things. They trim their beaks and dim the lights and change the group sizes around, which I'll talk about. And they've worked with perches, which perches actually are a good thing, but they decided they don't have room for them. They take up too much square footage in most cases. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these things in the interest of time and talk about beak trimming and light dimming. When a baby chick is just 1 day old, the baby chick is taken to have its beak trimmed so that it will not be able to peck itself and peck its cage mates very effectively. About 1/3 to 2/3 of the chick's beak will be taken off by a hot blade or an infrared beam with no anesthetic, and we know this hurts because there are dozens of nerves that run through all the way to the tip of a chick's beak. This picture's not showing up very well on my screen. I hope you can see it well. It's a picture of a baby chick on its first day of life having its beak taken off by a hot blade. Beak trimming causes a bunch of problems. Often the beaks get trimmed too quickly. They're working very quickly. They're just grabbing a chick, taking its beak, throwing it into the blade and cutting it off, and they don't take a lot of time to do this. And so it often happens that their beak gets trimmed too short, and then they can't eat or drink. In fact, the hens I told you about on Maui that were rescued by Laura Lee Blanchard and some others, they said that when they got the hens home, it was so sad because, first watching them, they'd never seen sun, never been out of their cage, and they were terrified at first. And over the days, they started to learn that they could open their wings out and stretch their wings out, and you could see the joy from this. But the sadness was that they would be fed food on the ground, and they would try to eat it, and as they picked their beaks up or picked their heads up, the food would fall straight out of their beaks. They can't groom themselves when they have their beaks cut off, and this raises their rate of ectoparasites. They get phantom pains like humans do that have amputated limbs because they develop neuromas from this. They have something called magnetoreception. Who knew that chickens could actually orient themselves based on iron mineral deposits in their beak? They can orient themselves using magnetic fields of the earth, but when you cut their beak off too short, they can't do that either. I thought that was fascinating. I've been vegan for 11 years, and I never knew. Interestingly, cannibalism rates are about 18% in cage-free system in birds with their beaks intact, but it's only 7% in birds where their beaks are trimmed. So it's still a big problem. Light dimming is another method they use to try to decrease the feather pecking from hen to hen. They dim the lights really low so that the hens can't see each other's sores and wounds and cloaca to peck them. But what happens is that the light's so low that when the workers go to inspect the hens, they can't even tell if that's a bloody wound or just dirt and feces. When they have an inspection, let's say the USDA comes in and does an inspection once a month or something, the lights get turned all the way up for an inspection. It terrifies the hens, and they become hysterical, and feather pecking and injuries actually increase. Another interesting study I came across, that I didn't find this study in hens, but I found it in turkeys, and I would expect it would be similar, is that turkeys in the exact same conditions suffer from eye problems that they can go blind from due to light dimming. Well, there are a lot of other issues with egg farms as well, and who knew that the stories would continue to go on. One of the worst ones I can think of are the hatcheries. Now, when you have billions of chickens being raised every year, many of them for egg production, as I mentioned, they only live for a year, you have to have hatcheries to replenish your hen supply. So there are these massive hatcheries that create about 4 million new chicks a year. Half of them are male and half of them are female. And as I've already pointed out, the laying hens are not bred to be big and meaty. So when you have a male laying hen, they're too small to be meat, they're not useful to the meat industry, and they can't lay eggs, so they're not useful to the egg-laying industry. So the male chicks are killed right after they're born. They go down a conveyor belt, and it's somebody's job, literally, to pick each hen up as fast as they can, turn it over and determine its sex. If it's a female, it goes down the line, and if it's a male, it gets thrown over the shoulder. You can see this on YouTube. It's absolutely horrific. Thrown over the person's shoulder, either into a huge garbage pail where the hens will eventually stack on top of each other and suffocate to death, or they get thrown over the shoulder into a grinder, and they will be ground alive. Another thing that the industry does is they force the hens to molt. And molting's when they lose their feathers. And they usually lose a few feathers on each side during molting season. They continue to lose them, but they're never bald. They never have bald spots in nature because they need their feathers for insulation. They need to be protected from water. So they never have bald spots when they molt naturally. But when they're done molting, their egg production levels increase a bit. And so what they do in the egg laying industry is when a hen has been in the industry for 1 or 2 cycles of egg laying, and they feel that she's not producing as many eggs as she should, they will force her to molt. And normally this molting process takes many weeks, but they don't have time to be feeding hens for many weeks while she naturally molts. So they force her to molt by dimming the lights extremely low and starving them of food and water for 14 days. This will put her body into shock. She'll lose about 1/3 of her body weight. Her body will be depleted of key nutrients, and she will lose all of her feathers at once. So many well-meaning people come to me and they say, well, I've heard all of that, or I've heard a lot of that, and I don't want to support that industry at all, so I buy cage-free or free-range eggs. Sadly, this is a marketing gimmick in most cases. Cage-free simply means that the hens are not in a cage. That's all it means, and I'll show you exactly what their conditions look like in a moment. Free-range means that the hens are not in a cage and they might have access, or they have access to the outdoors. I should say they do have access to the outdoors, but whether they actually get outdoors or not is another question. If you look at this picture here, you can see it's an egg-laying warehouse where it's a cage-free system. So there are no cages, that's true. These are cage-free hens. But you can see that they're still completely crowded together. I mean, they're so close together. They might have a few extra feet to walk around, walk around in, but they're still completely crammed. And in these kinds of conditions, the feather plucking actually ends up being worse than in a cage system. And the reason why is that not only are they so crowded together that they still feather pluck, just as badly as they do in the cages, but they can't be controlled by the employees now because they're not in cages. The employees can't come to the cages and try to fix any of these problems. As you can see, an employee is not going to get through this warehouse very easily. In a free-range system, many free-range houses look just like this. The hens are not in a cage, they're in a massive warehouse, but at the far end of this warehouse, there's a little door that the hens can go through, and outside that door is just a little area where they can go outside. Now, if you are a hen at this end of the warehouse, which is about a quarter of a mile away, you'll probably never even know that door exists. So free-range eggs, yeah, technically they meet the requirement for free range if the requirement is that they have access to the outdoors, but it doesn't mean that they'll ever get to see the outdoors. About what free range means, it doesn't mean a whole lot of anything. And organic only implies the standards are set with regard to feed and medicine. So you can't use medications in organic eggs because organic means you're not going to have those products in the eggs themselves when you sell them. The problem with this is that you'll have a lot of sick hens who need antibiotics. They're sick, they've been pecked, they have wounds, they have sores that are pussy and bloody, they need antibiotics. And in many cases, the egg producers will not give them the antibiotics they need because then they cannot sell the eggs. Hens producing organic eggs still suffer from all these same maladies that I talked about before. Organic does not mean cruelty-free. But people say, I buy eggs that have the cruelty-free stamp. I really look for that, and I make sure there's that cruelty-free stamp. Well, here's the problem with that. There are no standards in place, and there's no definition of cruelty-free. There is no definition in our food systems that says this is what cruelty-free must entail to use this stamp. And because there's no definition, there's no one enforcing this. Yet, egg producers know that there are people out there who really care about animals, and they will pay a lot more for their eggs if they believe they're cruelty-free. So, cruelty-free doesn't mean a whole lot of anything because there is no definition of it and it's not being enforced anyway. If you are one of those people that said, yeah, but I really looked into this and I started looking around and I called different producers and I think I found one that's really trying to be cruelty-free. Well, if that's true and they are cruelty-free, their baby chicks are still coming from the hatcheries where all the males are being thrown into grinders alive and being suffocated alive. So any which way you cut it with the egg industry, it's really almost impossible to get around the issue of cruelty. And finally, after a hen has lived this life that we've talked about, this life just 1 year, which should have been 6 out in nature with rain and wind in her feathers and sunlight and pecking the ground and raising her own baby chicks, but instead she's in these horrific conditions, in these cages with feces and sores and wounds and cannibalizing hen mates. And after all of this, she still goes to the exact same slaughterhouse that the broiler chickens are going to. And she will most likely, depending on the slaughterhouse, be hung upside down by her leg, alive, put on a conveyor belt, dipped down into electrified water bath to electrify her and electrocute her. And then after that point, her body, her stunned body, and hopefully unconscious body at that point, but not always unconscious, will be taken down the line to the automatic neck cutter. So, if I haven't depressed some of you yet, I hope I've at least made an impression if you weren't really aware of what's going on in detail in the egg industry. So I'd like to change and finish up my lecture with, well, gosh, I'm compelled now to cut dairy products out, but what will I eat? Many people come to me after lectures and they say to me, and this is why I wrote Vegetarian to Vegan, they say, well, I'm vegetarian, but wow, I can't be vegan because... And there's a list of obstacles they have. I could never give up cheese. I love cheese. Or, gosh, I don't know what I'd eat. I've already given up all meat and fish and poultry. If I gave up dairy, what would I eat? There'd be nothing left. So there's a host of obstacles that people have in their heads that make them feel that it's impossible to go vegan. And the good news is that it truly, these obstacles in your head are magnitudes bigger in your head than they are in reality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what to eat, give you some good news to end on here. There are scads and scads of vegan products out on the market now. And when I went vegan back in 2002, very few people knew what a vegan was, and there were very few vegan products on the market. And so there were a few vegan cheeses, but they were terrible. Soy cheese, by the way, I had a question about soy cheese. Soy cheese usually is not vegan. Soy cheese, usually they add casein to it, I think as a binder or something. So when you look for cheese and you see, the healthy cheese section that isn't made from animal products, you'll notice that soy cheese, if you turn over the ingredient list, almost always has casein. But the good news is that up in the top right-hand corner, you can see a picture of Daiya cheese. That's my absolute favorite. My dad and I love to have grilled cheese sandwiches on Sunday nights. Say that when I went vegan, I think one of the reasons why he was so upset that I went vegan is that was one of our rituals. There were no good vegan grilled cheese sandwiches back in the start of the century. But since Daiya came out, I can make the most incredible grilled cheese sandwich. I can use that vegan earth balanced butter that's pictured in the top middle. My dad has no clue. He says it tastes just like the old stuff that he always ate before. So the products are really, really good on the market now. The one caveat I will say about alternative milks, like soy milks and almond milks and things, is that I like to have non-fat milk on my cereal before I went vegan. And people told me, don't worry, go get some soy milk. It's great. You'll never know. It's great. Well, I did, and I bought some brand of soy milk. There were many brands, and it was horrible. It was terrible, and I thought, oh, gosh, I guess I can't have cereal anymore. This is just great, And then it wasn't for like 2 or 3 years that somebody told me this. They said the different types of milk taste very different, and you'll probably find one type that you like, but the different brands within those all taste different too. So it turns out that I love soy milk. I just found a brand that I didn't like. I found that West soy milk, the non-fat soy milk, to me, I can't taste the difference. I try to stay away from too many of what I call transition foods, these kind of higher fat vegan foods, because I just don't think it's optimal for our diets. But if you want a treat, or if you're transitioning and you're really missing your old favorites, go to the vegan transition foods. Coconut Bliss ice cream is absolutely divine. Really amazing. There's vegan versions of mayonnaise called like Nanaise or Veganase. There's vegan yogurts and cream cheeses and sour creams, all kinds of products, and most of them are really, really good. If you're wondering about eggs, there are a lot of egg substitutes as well. For example, if you like to have scrambled eggs, you can have scrambled tofu, and that's really delicious too. In fact, I prefer scrambled tofu because it has a little bit tougher consistency than scrambled eggs, which I find really runny. And so I actually prefer scrambled tofu. If you're a baker, and you like to bake, there's a lot of substitutes for baking. The one that I found is Energy Egg Replacer is a really great alternative to using eggs. But you can also use natural products like banana and applesauce and even oil. So I'm going to finish with a couple of things. One of them is what I call the great vegan secret. Now, this might be the best news for those of you who really think that you can't give up your favorite foods because you'd miss them so much, or those of you that have struggled with your weight. This is a really great secret, because if you struggle with your weight over and over and you've dieted and dieted and dieted, and you just can't seem to give up those favorite foods, and that's why your diet fails, here's the great vegan secret, and I know every vegan in this room that's here will absolutely concur with this. The great vegan secret is that when you cleanse your taste buds out for up to 30 days, it may not take 30 days, but it might give it 30 days. If you have an animal product-free diet, a full vegan diet, and if you really try to stay away from really fatty foods, fatty vegan foods like French fries, salty foods, sugary foods, and you have a healthy, vegan, whole plant foods-based diet for 30 days, your taste buds will revert to their natural state. What will happen is that foods that were just okay when you were eating, pepperoni pizza or cheese pizza, foods that were okay back then, like apples. Like, I'm from Washington, and apples are everywhere. And before I was vegan, apples are fine. Yeah, I like apples. Now, when I eat an apple, I am in nirvana. A crisp, cold apple will send me over the edge. Corn and carrots and greens and sprouts. They really I start tasting the different flavors of romaine lettuce, versus spinach, versus, just butter lettuces. I can actually taste the lettuces now because my taste buds have become so sensitized. So if you can get yourself to eat a healthy diet for just 30 days, That is when becoming vegan and staying vegan becomes effortless. It takes no willpower, because not only do vegan foods start to taste great, but you prefer them. So knowing that that takes 30 days, I'm going to issue a challenge. And the challenge is the 30-day vegan challenge. To go vegan, and again, I'm going to stress, go healthy vegan. Try really hard not to be eating tons of ice creams and vegan cheeses and other salty or fatty vegan substitute foods, but go healthy vegan for 30 days. And then report back to me and let me know how you're doing, because I have had more people tell me that if they could just make it through 30 days, they never looked back. Never looked back. You can reach me at thevegannextdoor.com. I have a Facebook page that's the same, and I have a blog, so whenever I post a new blog, it gets posted on Facebook and will show up on your wall. I do have my new book, Vegetarian to Vegan, coming out, so there's a sign-up sheet on the back if you'd like to have an email when that's available. My current book, Vegan in 30 Days, is on sale for $10 in the back of the room. And before I leave you with a final word, I do want to thank a couple of people very close to me in my life that aren't here tonight, but my husband, Mark Taylor. I was not vegan when he married me, and so he has lived through this process with me. He's been extremely supportive and has joined me along the way, almost completely vegan himself, but a little bit vegetarian. And Laura Lee Blanchard on Maui, she owns Leilani Farm Sanctuary. We actually live on the property together now when I'm in Maui, and she has an amazing farm sanctuary so that when you get over to Maui, you can go and have her give you a tour around the farm, and she'll introduce you to chickens. If you've never met a chicken and held a chicken, and actually looked at one and pet one and seen their funny little personalities, she would take us into her house and say, wait 5 minutes and Akachan will come in, and he'll run up the stairs as soon as you open the door and go look for the cat food. And 5 minutes later, here comes the chicken, and she opens the door and he took a left and ran up the stairs to go look for the cat food. I mean, they're funny. They're just like our little cats and dogs, and I think it's a shame that they don't have waggy tails or look particularly cute, but I don't think that means that they're any less deserving of our love and compassion. I'd like to leave you with just one last thought, and that thought is that going vegan, it can seem overwhelming, and I understand that, I empathize with that, but really it's just a matter of having the right information at the right time in your life. And when you come across that right information, and when you're receptive to receiving that information, then if it's compelling, you won't need willpower to go vegan. Willpower will have nothing to do with it, because you will have the knowledge that you need to make complete and radical changes in your diet and do it effortlessly. So I'd like to finish with a quote from James Gordon. I have no idea who he is, but he gave a great quote. And the quote is this: "It's not that some people have willpower and some don't. It's that some people are ready to change." Thank you.
We'd now like to invite you all to join us in the courtyard for some tasty vegan refreshments courtesy of Down to Earth. Mahalo to all of you for coming this evening, and have a safe return home. Good night, everyone.
This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.